Well, Representative, appreciate your time, sir. Thank you very much for coming on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let me just ask you, first of all, your thoughts on today's oversight hearing.
If it's possible to sit through 2 hours worth of a hearing and no less than you did before it started, that's kind of where I am. I thought I asked fairly direct, straightforward questions of the special agent in charge. I still cannot tell you how they thought this ill-conceived investigation would ever work. And I think
just in terms of the practical matters of how this would work. Is that what you mean?
Well, I mean, even if it had worked, in quotes, it never would have worked. There are plenty of tools available already to investigate gun trafficking. In fact, we went through some of those penalties. There are penalties up to and including life imprisonment for 924E, and you can get up to 60 years for 924C. One of the lines of questions that Representative Chaffetz and former U.S. Attorney Meehan and I pursued is when ATF knew the first gun from Arizona made it into Mexico. All right, that gun has a serial number. Did you then trace the gun back and go interview your suspected straw purchaser? And the answer was no. They didn't do any of the investigative techniques that we use every day all across this country, from car stops to interviews to grand jury investigations to search warrants. Didn't do any of that. I still cannot tell you, despite having asked the question a half dozen times, you're not going to extradite drug kingpins from Mexico back to the United States, particularly when Mexico has been shut out of the investigation in the first place.
Well, absolutely. And not only were law enforcement in Mexico shut out of this operation, apparently U.S. law enforcement operating in Mexico were shut out of Fast and Furious, too.
Yes. Former U.S. Attorney Meehan and I and Raul Labrador, who also is an attorney from Idaho, kind of coordinated a line of attack where one of the ATF agents said he told the ATF agent in Mexico about Fast and Furious, and the ATF agent in Mexico, sitting one person down from him, said, "You never told me. I never knew about it." It was ill-conceived, ill-executed, whatever other modifier you want to use. It never would have worked, even if it had, quote, been successful, which it wasn't going to be. Mm-hmm. And the question is, who knew about it when? Why did they fail to take steps that would have aborted this ill-fated investigation to begin with? How high up within the Department of Justice it went? The U.S. Attorney's Office. It was an OCDEF case, so there was more than one agency involved. I left with more questions than I got answers.
I guess that means we're going to see more hearings then.
Oh, yes. You are going to see hearings, both judiciary and oversight, until we have a very firm idea of who hatched this ill-conceived investigation and whether or not people knew about it months, if not years in advance, failed to tell their own colleagues in Mexico, failed to tell our brothers and sisters in law enforcement and prosecutors' offices in Mexico. I mean, imagine this. We're not going to tell our colleagues in Mexico what we're doing. Mm-hmm. But once we make our big bust, we're going to ask the Mexican criminal justice system to take care of it. What would happen if Mexico did this kind of investigation on our soil and didn't tell us about it?
Absolutely.
There'd be outrage.
Can you imagine if the Mexican government decided, we're going to truck 12 tons of methamphetamine into South Texas and just see where it winds up so we can go after the drug kingpins in the United States?
And even so, they can't go after the drug kingpins. Only the United States could do it. And imagine how reluctant we'd be to do it if you never told us what you were doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the exchanges that your colleague, Congressman Labrador, had today with Bill Newell centered on Kevin O'Neill, who works in the White House. And Newell admitted that they did discuss Kevin O'Reilly, that they did discuss Fast and Furious. That would indicate, again, at least one person in the White House was aware of this operation. Do you believe that there are others?
Well, we followed up after that. Labrador did a fantastic job of setting that table. And then there was a subsequent question where there was an email that said, "You didn't get this from me." All right. Now, when do you ever tell someone you didn't get this from me? When you're telling them something that you should not be telling.
Uh-huh.
So in an email from Special Agent Newell to Mr. O'Reilly are the words, "You didn't get this from me." Why? If there's nothing wrong with the communication, why would you say you didn't get this from me?
Yeah.
If there's something wrong with the communication, tell me what was wrong with it.
And what was Mr. Newell's response?
That they were friends and that it was a poor choice of words. That is manifestly obvious. I suspect and will only know as we continue to ask people under oath with consequences for not telling the truth. That's the only way to be able to do these things. You have to ask people under oath with consequences so we can establish once and for all the chronology, who knew about it, if anyone tried to cover it up, who did. I've been doing this for 16 years.
Mm-hmm.
6 years as a federal prosecutor, working with ATF every single day, and then 10 years as a state DA. Everything from shoplifting to capital murder. I've never, ever seen guns allowed to walk, ever.
Congressman, let me ask you, some of your colleagues, including Representative Cummings on the House Oversight Committee, Representative Maloney, have been saying that, and even some ATF officials, I mean, we saw a front-page story in the Washington Post today making the same argument, that the ATF's hands were tied because of the lack of gun laws that we have in this country, and that a straw buy is only a paperwork violation, and typically people only get probation. And so the ATF agents and the DOJ officials and DEA and FBI and whoever else was involved, they were sort of forced into this type of investigation. What's your response to that?
My response is that law enforcement officers should not concern themselves with the penalties. That's up to a court. I had this conversation once with some of the agents I used to work with. It's not their job to decide sentences. Their job is to investigate and bring to prosecutors cases that have a reasonable likelihood of a successful prosecution. You don't turn your back on crime because you don't think the penalty is serious enough. You can get up to 10 years for lying and buying. You can get 5 years for the first 924C, which is using a firearm during the commission of a drug trafficking offense. You can get 15 or 20 years for the second offense, 25 or 30 years for the second offense, for the third offense. So now you're up to almost 60 years cumulatively if you indeed are using these firearms in furtherance of a drug conspiracy. This was an OCDETF case. There's a D in OCDETF. There had to be drugs involved. So you use Title 21 if you have to. You don't sit here and complain that, I mean, that's why I use part of my questioning to establish not only the full toolbox of investigative tools that they have a toolbox full of penalties too. 922G1, 924E, 924C. Another trafficking statute is not going to solve ill-fated, ill-conceived, ill-founded investigations. It's a red herring that if you want to debate whether or not we need additional laws or other penalties, then have that hearing. Mm-hmm. This isn't about that. And to hide behind that because you conceived one of the worst investigative strategies I have ever seen is a subterfuge, and only a couple of my colleagues fell for it.
Well, that's good to hear. So what do you think happens next, Congressman?
I think we're going to continue to have hearings. We're going to continue to seek documents. We're going to continue to try to follow the chronology of who knew what when. We're going to try to maintain. You know, I was in Mexico with Mr. Isa a couple of weekends ago. We flew down there to talk to the federal police and to representatives from the Attorney General's office. Mexico is trying to reform its law enforcement, judicial, and prosecutorial entities, and they're doing it in the face of tremendous violence. I just cannot imagine the kick in the stomach of knowing that someone who's supposed to be a partner with you is allowing guns or knowing guns are coming into Mexico, and you don't even bother to tell them. You don't tell your colleagues in ATF who are working in Mexico City, and you don't tell your alleged partners in Mexico. I think the next step, number one, we got to make sure that our relationship stays strong and we continue to encourage Mexico to do a good job on their side of the border. If they feel like they need a Title 18 conspiracy statute, in addition to the ones that already exist. They're welcome to come make their case before Congress. If they want to go before the sentencing guidelines and ask for enhancements for straw purchasers, but straw purchasers by definition don't have criminal records.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not up to law enforcement to decide which crimes they think are worth pursuing and which ones are not. That's not what they're called to do.
You know, one other item I wanted to ask you about. Yesterday, Fox News reported that 2 of the 20 individuals who are under indictment in Phoenix, who allegedly bought some of these firearms. In fact, I think they bought 360 over a more than a year-long period. They're prohibited persons. A NICS check should have been done, apparently was done, and it should have, thrown up a red flag, and they should not have been able to buy firearms, and yet they were. ATF agent John Dodson said, typically what happens is the NICS folks will call ATF, and then ATF would say, we'll let the sale go through. First of all, how concerning is that you've got prohibited people who are apparently being allowed to purchase firearms? And 2, does it seem a little curious that prohibited people would walk into a gun store and attempt to buy knowing that they're going to go through the background check? I mean, that just doesn't add up to me.
It's more than curious. That was a line of question that I had prepared to ask this morning. And before a questioning began, I sat down with a staff from OGR to make absolutely sure, because as a prosecutor, you can't just rely on a media story. You have to have cold, hard facts. It appears as if these 2 became prohibited persons during the course of the investigation. In other words, they were under indictment during the course of the investigation, because I asked specifically, were there any prohibited persons that were kind of waved through and allowed to purchase firearms? That is not an acceptable investigative technique. That is aiding and abetting a crime. And you need to find another way other than to use – NCIC is too valuable of an asset to either ignore it or ignore shortcomings. So either NCIC was insufficient, or you've got one agency saying ignore the pendency of an indictment or conviction, or it could have been, and I want to withhold judgment, it could have been they became prohibited persons during the pendency of the investigation, in which case you need to ask yourself, did they purchase any firearms after they became a prohibited person? I don't have enough facts to answer that question.
All right, but something we definitely need to learn more about.
That would be absolutely blockbuster if law enforcement winked and nodded while prohibited persons purchased firearms. That would be huge.
Yeah, considering, considering everything we know already, and I really feel like we're just scratching the surface, this is already a blockbuster scandal, if you want to call it that.
It is, and I will tell you this, what I said this morning. It's a very sad day for a former prosecutor who worked with some wonderful ATF agents in the upstate of South Carolina, many of whom are still my friends. It's a sad day for those that play by the rules to be sullied because some colleagues dreamt up one of the worst conceptualizations of an investigation I've ever heard of. It's a sad day. I take no delight in this at all.
Yeah.
I am a huge fan of law enforcement and all their sacrifices. They're some of my closest friends. I take no delight in what we had to do today. But when people begin to not have confidence in the criminal justice system, we are finished as a republic.
Absolutely. And, I know as a prosecutor, you don't want to speculate on motive, but let me ask you this. Does the official explanation for why Fast and Furious was dreamt up and why it was executed, does it make sense to you? Does it pass the smell test?
No. As I have been saying from the very beginning, it never would have worked if it had, quote, worked. It never would have done what Special Agent Newell wanted, which was to destroy, dismantle, disrupt Mexican drug cartels. Mexico's not going to extradite people for lying and buying cases. ATF doesn't have Title 21 jurisdiction for drug cases. And further to same, if we're violating Mexican law in the process, can Mexico then turn around and ask us to extradite the federal law enforcement officers who aided and abetted the violation of their sovereign nation's laws?
Well,
Are we going to get there?
your counterparts in Mexico, some of them are already calling for that.
Well, the doctrine of unclean hands is an equitable doctrine, and you don't ever want to be there if you're in the. I hold the criminal justice system, including prosecutors, to a very high standard. You don't ever want to be there.
Congressman, listen, I can't thank you enough for coming on the program, sir. I hope we can do it again very soon, and thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you. God bless. I'll see you.
Thank you, sir. Congressman Trey Gowdy joining us here on Cam and Company.